Welcome, and my name's Fiona Maxwell. I'm head of the Heritage Stakeholder Relationships here at the BFI. Been here for over a decade, and I'm very pleased to have such an illustrious panel, international panel of experts to talk to you today. And the format will be I will make some introductions, I have some questions for the panel, there'll be a little film to show some processing, and then we will open to questions and there'll be a roving mic. So to introduce our panel, first of all, I have beside me Antonio Rasura from Kodak. Antonio is the Technical Director of Motion Picture Lab Services and Preservation Products, Europe, USA, Asia at Kodak. He spent 30 years in the industry as a workflow specialist, as well as establishing and managing photochemical laboratories, post and archive services. Antonio has built and managed and operated labs in 11 countries all around the world. Next to Antonio, we have Sonii Clarke. Sonii is Head of Business Development at Cinelab, Cine Film and Digital, and she looks after archive and new products. Cinelab is film and digital, and it's a full-service lab here in the UK, the only one that can process digital dailies. And they process and scan, restore Super 8, 60mm, 35mm, and even 65mm. So welcome, Sonii. Next to Sonii, we have Davide Pozzi from Meacham, Ritrovata. And Davide is the director of the group. And today, that includes 4 branches, Bologna, Haga Film in the Netherlands, Ritrovata, Eclair Classics in Paris, and Ritrovata Asia and Hong Kong. Welcome, Davide. Next to Davide, we have Michael Pogorzeiski. He is from the archive. He's the director of the Academy Film Archive in Hollywood, California, so truly international today. And he was named the director of the Academy back in 2000, and he oversees a staff of 30 curators and archivists, preservationists, cataloguers, and supervisors for restoration. Michael himself has restored over 60 films, including Best Picture winners, How Green Was My Valley, All the King's Men, All About Eve, and Oliver. Welcome, Michael. Beside Michael, we have another American guest, Michael Meacham. Brian even.
Brian even.
Just renamed you, Brian. Brian Meacham from the Yale Film Archive. Brian is the managing archivist at Yale, where he oversees the film. He's overseen the film collection since 2013, responsible for acquisition and inspection, cataloguing, preservation of the whole archives collection. It includes thousands of prints and preprint elements acquired by the university over the last 50 years. A 2006 graduate of the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation, Brian has previously worked at the Harvard Film Archive and with Michael at the Academy Film Archive. And last but certainly not least, we have Alexa Raisbeck, who is a freelance projectionist. Alexa has worked in the film exhibition industry for over 22 years. 18 of those as film projectionists. She's worked at the BFI and as a technical supervisor, run film premieres in Leicester Square, trained as an IMAX assistant engineer in Canada, and now she's working in software. Alexa also freelances in film projection and teaches and trains projectionists via the Film Projection Heritage Network, an organization she's helped found, and we'll ask her a little bit more about that later on. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Should be a good session. So Antonio, coming to you first. Without stock, we can't really shoot anything on film. So if a distributor wants to project on celluloid and a filmmaker wants to shoot, what can be achieved without film stock? Can you describe the products that Kodak manufacture and the differences between them?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm unashamedly going to be referring to notes, so for 2 reasons. 1, I won't forget, and 2, I won't waffle. Right, so Kodak Motion Picture Group is subdivided into 3 key categories. There are 3 product category groups. We have our origination film platform, we have a distribution film platform, and we have an archive film platform. In the origination, it's just that. It is our camera films. We have color camera negative in color and black and white, and in all formats, from Super 8, 16, 35, and then of course our premium format, 65 mil. It forms the largest part of our product portfolio in terms of volume and in terms of sales. It is also the only product that really fits within the creative element. It's it appeals to filmmakers looking to create something on film. It has, I think there can be an entire panel discussion brought together to talk about the aesthetic qualities of film. And I think if we do that, we're never going to get through everything else. So I'm just going to say that our origination platform, the biggest platform, it is the platform that is still premium choice for filmmakers. Hence the filmmakers bit. The distribution platform, sorry, there are three. Distribution, it is essentially print film. Print film that we've just come back, I've just come out of Rebel Without a Cause. Beautiful print, restored. It was the largest product portfolio for any filmmaker prior to 2000, 2007, 2008, where digital projection film projection gave way to digital projection. So we don't see those numbers anymore. It is a product group that we're still very supportive of, and most importantly, it's stabilized over the last few years. In fact, there's almost a resurgence in moviegoers actively going out there to find venues that are projecting on print. And then, of course, we're also doing we're using that film platform for alternative users. And finally is our preservation film platform. This is a key part of our portfolio in terms of for institutions just like the BFI, in order to pay homage to their cultural preservation mandate. That is about putting content on film and making it accessible for the future. Contrary to everything that's said, there is just one media type that absolutely guarantees the ability to recover content in decades and perhaps even centuries ahead. And when I say centuries, we talk about our black and white film platform having up to 500 years of image stability. And I don't know if there's anybody here that knows about a small company in Norway called Pickle. We produced a film stock for them. They had that independently tested to demonstrate a life expectancy of 2,000 years.
It'll outlive all of us.
Quite, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Nobody around to prove it.
No.
But,
So talking about the future then, what's KODAK'S vision for keeping film on film as a medium? What's the strategy?
That's a great question, and we talk about strategy a lot. I think the first thing to start off with is the film, and when I say film, we talk about consumer film and motion picture film. Consumer film being your standard 35 mil that you're out there in the consumer space, 120 and other formats. Together, year over year, those platforms or that film product has been growing. So much so that we've actually had to go back to a 24/7 in our finishing department. So you're surprised to hear. And that's just to cater for the demand. If we take all film, so that's motion picture film, consumer film, industrial film, chemical applications, all part of the same group, that accounted for 20% of Eastman Kodak Company's revenue for last year. On the basis of that led us to implementing a 10-year plan. And I think this is the first time that we've been able to say this. We have a 10-year plan. And within that 10-year plan, it's to stabilize the manufacturing process. And when I say stabilize it, it's going to come through investment. And when I say investment, it's going to be investment in equipment, manufacturing capacity, but it is also an investment in people. We've just taken on and filled 100 new positions in Kodak, and it really is about allowing us to secure talent, skills in film technology and manufacturing processes for this duration. Don't see 10 years as the hard cap. It's just that no company, very few companies, can see beyond 10 years. We don't know what's going to happen. But what's important is that our CEO has taken a 10-year view of this, and we're going to stabilize our manufacturing division.
That's very encouraging to hear. What about the challenges of raw stock and the environment with all the regulations?
Yes, another great question. part of our 10-year plan, we had to look, and this goes back to the lessons that we've all learned around the pandemic, right? Access and to raw materials, components, ground to a halt, and it was no different for Kodak. We had to take a view where we strategically monitor this going forward. We've taken a multifaceted approach to this. The first will be to establish multi-year agreements with vendors, suppliers that supply upstream raw materials to Kodak. And we're moving away from risk associated to single suppliers, single source suppliers. The second will be an approach where we agree to and approve multi-year buyouts. And those will be with products raw materials that are at risk. We will pre-buy them, and that will give us time to execute on our third initiative, which is an entire development team that is set to identify raw materials that are potentially at risk from an environmental or regulatory perspective. We will then have a development team inside Kodak actively working to find substitutes to replace those. So we're bringing everything back in-house.
Again, good to hear. The 10 years you mentioned, if we were to say how long will Kodak continue making film, can you put a number?
Yep. Our CEO has been definitive on this point. We will produce film for as long as there is demand. And I think as I mentioned earlier, this 10-year plan that we had, which will stabilize our manufacturing, is part of that. We believe that there's demand, certainly in both the consumer space and the motion picture space for the next 10 years. He's underscored that with investment in capital, infrastructure, sensitizing operations, which will be upgraded. But we've also taken a long-term view and strategy on succession planning in the organization. And then finally, there's a strong focus on finding new products and services and markets utilizing the skills that we have in our sensitizing operations.
Fantastic. I think at the end we might come back more to skills and apprenticeships and so forth.
We'll talk about that, yes.
Let's move on to Sonii. So Sonii, tell us about recent new productions that you've chosen, where the directors or filmmakers have chosen to shoot on film or that are hybrid productions, and what the current climate is for film like that.
Yeah, I'd say there are a significant amount of productions shooting on film. In terms of our company, in 2013 we processed 500,000 feet of film. 5 years on from that, it was 5 million feet of film. And we're 10 years on, and those numbers continue to grow. At Cannes, the nominations this year, 20% of those were shot on film. And the winner of the series, the best series at Cannes, was a 16mm Norwegian production that was that we provided full daily service for a 125-day shoot. So that's quite significant. If we look back a bit on a larger scale, there was Bond, that was over 1 million feet of 65 and 35mm. All seasons of Succession, that was shot on 35mm. And in terms of a hybrid, I'd say, the BFI's own Edgar Wright, Last Night in Soho, that used digital and film alongside to create that sort of amazing look.
Fantastic. And can you explain then what would lead a filmmaker to choose to shoot on film and output to film if he's shooting digitally, he or she?
I think what we really see is that the DOPs that we work with, they get a real joy out of exploring all the different technical choices that you can make when you're sort of coming up with a creative idea. So from the lens to the camera to the stock to the processing, all of that sort of, and often on short form creative projects, that's when they may experiment and gain knowledge, because ultimately you're limited by the length of the camera roll, but that sort of discipline is transferable on a film shoot or on a digital shoot. And on some digital shoots, they will then create a 35mm neg or a print, and then that's an archival master. That's a true master that's director approved and not easy to alter. And there's reassurance in having that physical form. And as you said, it can be shot through, in 100 years.
Yeah, exactly. At least we know with film how long that lasts. And,
yes.
ongoing. I'm not sure about your figure. We'll come back to that. As you say, who's there to disprove it? Davide, coming on to you. So you're responsible for 2 photochemical laboratories now, one Bologna, Italy, and one in the Netherlands. So can you tell us about how the two, what they specialize in? Do you have one for restoration, one for processing? Tell us about them.
I mean, the lab in Bologna has only 2 lines, and we are only focused on film restoration. We can process, of course, black and white and color. But the most important lab is in the Netherlands, is AGFIM, because it's an historical lab. We just moved 2 years ago in a new building that I'm going to show you later. And in fact, here we have 4 lines. 3 35, 1 16. The 35 we have 1 for black and white, of course, where we process well the sound, and 2 35 for color, and the last line is for 16. And in AGFIM we process for film restoration purposes, but as well for features. For instance, she was mentioning Cannes, and there was a Dutch title in Cannes, Occupied City, that was premiered and was shot on film, and it was at 4 hour and a half film long. And for talking about, numbers or the number of production shooting on film now, I have to say that at the end of the month, we will start to work on 4 features to be processed.
Wonderful. And we have Peter from Hagerfelders over there in the white suit. Welcome, Peter. Nice to have you here.
Years and years of experience.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've toured that lab. So I believe you've got a short film to show us.
Because we have a mixed public today. A lot are professionals, but not all. So I like to show you what does it mean to process. A processing department. We can
hopefully we have the technical support to be able to bring this up. And here we go. Thank you for showing us.
That. It will be online end of the month.
And people can move around and take a virtual
absolutely.
tour.
Different department. Not only the processing department, but all the department: grading, optical print, contact print, sound, and so on.
Very exciting. So lastly, can you talk about noticing the demand there for both preservation and again, filmmakers that are choosing in Europe to shoot on film?
As I say, the number of production shot on film is increasing, but as well, we have a lot of restoration that we put back on film. And if I can maybe be a little bit provocative,
why not?
I like to say that to be extremely frank, I think that the number of production shooting on film is increasing. I think not only because of artistic reason or aesthetical reason, which are completely true, but as well because I think a lot of producer, because finally they put the money on the production, had some bad surprise with some LTOs or drives, and I think that today they are much more aware how much important is to have something, a picture physically on some asset, because they know today that what they are shooting has a value, is an asset, and they don't want to lose the money they invested. And I think this is not randomly. I think there is a very specific reason. So, and I think that finally, today we are facing likely an increasing number of production for both reasons, artistical, of course, but as well because even the producer, maybe they are safer producing on film. That's my very personal point of view.
I think there's a few people in the room who would agree with you on that.
We can mention a lot of bad example of Oscar-winning title that unfortunately the data are lost, and when they have to do HDR master, they make a scan of a print of an internegative.
No names.
No names. Well, maybe later.
Yes.
Michael.
Well, that moves very nicely on to Michael, because Michael, tell us about the work at the Academy in preserving film heritage.
Yeah, the Academy was founded in 1927, and the first films arrived in 1929, even though the the Academy itself didn't have any mandate to do preservation work. That was when sound was coming in, and a lot of the silent film pioneers and the silent film companies were starting to go out of business, and everyone agreed that what they had in their collections, the scripts and papers and films, was important, but there was no library or institution in Los Angeles to collect them. So the Academy just said, okay, we'll store the stuff. And that basically is what happened until after World War II, when Margaret Herrick, who was the executive director of the Academy, actually created a library to start to organize the collection and to make it accessible. And over the next 50 years, there were just kind of staff who took care of the film collection on their sort of own time, because the Academy Film Archive wasn't established until 1990, 91. And since then, we've become the third largest film archive collection in the United States, behind UCLA Film and Television Archive and the Library of Congress. And so we've been, have an active preservation program, and what we've been doing mainly over the course of the last 15 years has been saving film that has been abandoned during the digital transition. Our collection grew pretty consistently from 1991 to 2013, between 5 to 7% per year. But then when you hit 2013, the percentages go up into double digits, because we've been calling the 2000 teens the deluge years, because we were just deluged with offers of film. Laboratories that were closing, post-production houses that were closing, even storage facilities that were closing. They would call, and just different variations of the same call, like, there's a ton of film here, come and take whatever you want, but you have to come by the end of the month, or sometimes by the end of the week, because our bankruptcy proceeding is done, or our lease is up. So I know there are a lot of people here at the festival and maybe listening to the recording of this. If you know any filmmakers who say, I made this film in the 1990s, but the lab closed and I have no idea what happened to the negatives or to my film elements, have them contact us at the Academy.
Are you sure? Are you sure?
Yes, no, I'm very serious. Filmarchive@oscars.org. All of our contact information is on our website. One of the best parts of this project, well, let's say one of the worst parts, is we have the largest backlog we've ever had at the archive, because we have so much material that we can't or couldn't process during COVID because we were working at home and we couldn't handle film. So that's a little anxiety producing, because the backlog is huge. But the good part is that we've reunited over 90 filmmakers with their film elements. Wow. And of those filmmakers, 2 have taken their films back. One was a French filmmaker who wanted her negatives returned to France, and the other was a documentarian who made his film for HBO, and they have a wonderful archive of their own. All of those other filmmakers have been suspicious at first, because we're like, no, we'll store your film elements for free. And they're like, yeah, for free? What's the catch? They're independent filmmakers, right? They're used to having to have their wits about them. But eventually they come around and they're overjoyed that, number one, their films exist, but number 2, they're in a place where they'll be taken care of by people who can conserve and preserve them. And so a lot of people associate film archives with what we've been talking about, during this festival, is like old films, nitrate films that are dusty and deteriorating. But what we've mainly been collecting are films made in the last 20, 25, 30 years.
And you mean internationally? It's not just American films you've got all over the world?
Well, mainly the facilities that have been closing in the United States.
Okay.
So it's primarily North American. I mean, there have been some international films that were, for whatever reason, were processed or finished in the U.S.
I know that you had the foresight a good decade ago to look at preserving film and making film prints. As you were saying, perhaps labs closing. Can you tell us about that project?
Yeah, actually, Brian here was part of the preservation staff in 2011, and we saw kind of the writing on the wall that the deluge was coming, because as you mentioned, the years 2005 to 2012 was really when everything changed, when the number of prints and the number of theaters screening movies on film dropped dramatically and were replaced by digital projection. And so we saw, or wanted to get ahead of that. And so we created this program to not only create film prints of missing Academy Award nominees or films that we anticipated really needed to be seen on film, but we also used the project to print things that weren't scannable at that time. So shrunken or brittle nitrate, it's actually much easier to print that type of film than to scan it, at least back then. I mean, scanning has come a long way since then. And so, yes, the Academy Museum is regularly screening the prints that we made during that project. I'm happy to say that, again, not to sound braggadocious or anything, but everything we predicted then came to pass, everything. And so we're really happy, and I hope all of you come to Los Angeles to see the Academy Museum, which is absolutely fantastic, but also get a chance to see a film projected in one of the two theaters at the museum, one that's a 1,000-seat theater and one that's just under 300. And we're told by the programmers that when audiences find out, well, we're screening a print from the Academy Film Archives collection, they like go nuts and are applauding like, you know, someone has just gotten on stage and said, LA, are you ready to rock 5 times? So we're very proud of that and very happy that this is the reason that we've been building the collection, is to actually have it used and be seen. And now the museum is the place where people can actually see everything that we've made.
I can vouch for that. It's a wonderful, wonderful visit. Yes, and fabulous building. So what would you say are your current concerns? You had that foresight back then. You made those prints. You're storing them beautifully. You have a place to exhibit them. But right now, your concerns about film on film in this current climate?
Well, we have a limited budget, like all archives do, so we just have to be very specific about what we're going to be using that budget for to print. And so it's been a collaboration again with the museum. One of the first exhibits when the museum opened was around Studio Ghibli and primarily Hideo Miyazaki, the wonderful Japanese animator. So we created a set of new 35mm prints of all of Miyazaki's films, which is unique, and also points out one of it's not the availability of film stock necessarily that is the cause for concern. It's all of the ancillary technologies around making film. So in the case of the Miyazaki prints, they need English subtitles. Well, there are only a handful of places left in the world that can actually laser title film prints. And that's concerning because we can't, if we don't have the ability to laser title film, then we can't really make films in any other language or make prints in any other language than English. The other technology that is concerning is we worked with the Film Foundation before the museum opened to create a collection of 70mm prints. The Geffen Theater, the 1,000-seat theater I mentioned, is the best place to screen 70mm in the world. And I encourage you to put any theater against it in terms of projecting 70. But what difference does that make if you don't have 70mm prints to screen? But what we were concerned about there, while we started working on this in 2015 and the project finally got off the ground in 2017-18, is that if you want to have sync sound with a 70mm print, there's only one company that shoots control tracks to keep the sound synchronized to the picture. And they were announcing end of life for that technology. And it was only the filmmakers who were interested in releasing their films in 70mm, like Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino, when they saw like, oh, well, there could still be money in this, the technology is still available. But if that goes away, no more 70mm prints because there's no way to keep the sound in sync.
Is it also a concern about the directors that you've just mentioned, that generation, who's coming up behind them that want to also shoot that way? You know, who's coming up behind Tarantino and Christopher Nolan?
Paul Thomas Anderson has released his last 5 films, I think, in 70mm. I can't think of, it's just a handful. Yeah, but it's a good point.
I guess the
Right,
catch
maybe.
is you have to be fairly established to get the money to be able to go there. So a young filmmaker can't immediately shoot in 70 mil. But yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. Yeah. Thank you very much, Michael. That takes us on very nicely to Brian and looking at the academic angle. So Brian, can you talk us through Yale's strategy and collecting prints for screening and what you think the benefits of actually screening on film are?
Sure, yeah. So Yale's collection dates back to the late 1960s when faculty in the School of Art and the History of Art department wanted to teach film and were tired of renting films from the Museum of Modern Art or distributors whose films were in questionable condition. So they started buying film prints, and about 30 years later established a Film Studies Center, which is the precursor to the institution now known as the Yale Film Archive. And really, for much of that time, it was mainly internal use. So students going through Yale and turning out to be people like Paul Giamatti and Meryl Streep and Angela Bassett, all of those folks would have seen films, partially rented from outside, but also from within this internal collection. And so when I arrived after 7 years at the Academy, learning under Mike and his colleagues, and seeing sort of the value of preserving film on film and the wonderful screening venues that the Academy has and the effect of screening film on film for audiences, I wanted to sort of put that stamp on the Yale sort of system. And so it's been a priority of mine since I got there 10 years ago to seek out original elements that may have fallen through the cracks, whether they're from lab closures or from, we have a lot of filmmakers who just keep their films in a closet, in a shoebox, in their basement, in their attic, and film, as remarkably resilient and remarkably stable if it's left in a stable environment, even if that environment isn't that great. And so getting those original materials, preserving those on film, as well as producing a digital component, and then acquiring as many prints for screening as we can. And so, I have to thank all of you, Fiona and Kieran and Amy and all of your colleagues for the wonderful collaboration over the last few years that has enabled Yale to sort of follow suit with what the BFI has done on a much smaller scale, but acquire 25 or 30 new prints that we never would have had the opportunity to of just some of the greatest titles ever. And so it's been really wonderful because it's been a sort of a cycle of education within Yale to impress upon the people who control the budgets that this is not like a streaming license that expires at the end of this academic year. This is forever. This is forever for a very useful, it's 100 years, 500 years, whatever it is, long past any of our lifetimes, we're going to have these film prints. And I think we've really seen since the pandemic and with events in person returning, I've really seen more undergraduates at film events than I ever did in the first 6 years I worked there. And they are coming back because these are real events that are happening in a group, in community, in the dark, all focused on the same thing. And it's not just, pixels being projected onto screen. They can look back, they can see the projector, and they know that this is an event which is going to be different every time it happens. I tell the story of the print when I introduce the film, where it came from, how we made it. Is it old? Is it new? Is it from a collector? All that sort of stuff. And I think students are really sort of, they're really attracted to that, and they're really finding it something that's worth their time in a very busy life that they have. So.
Before I ask you another question, I
Yeah.
just want to explain for the audience's benefit what Brian was referring to, which is the BFI for the past 5 years have had a project, a heritage film project, where we've made 100 new prints. 8 of them are in the festival. They're all premieres. This is the first public outing for any of these prints, and we've been using the wonderful services of some of these people behind the panel, and very much sharing. There's a lot of research that goes into finding the correct elements and printable elements to be able to work this out, and even labs that we can find to help us depending on where those film elements are held, because sometimes we're shipping them right around the world. So we have regular catch-ups, which is very, very useful for us all to share information about where things are, and then get some benefit of together saying, okay, the BFI are going to ship that original negative from Australia to Portugal or to Bologna, wherever we can, because there are no labs left in Australasia or Asia, photochemical labs. They don't exist there now. So it's very much a community to be able to help each other with this, and then get the support to say, okay, the BFI have selected these titles with our curators. how do Yale feel about this? How do the Academy feel? Would you like 1, 2? So that's what Brian is referring to. We've very much worked together on this. So Brian, as an academic archive serving both student population and your local community, how do you think the appetite for film on film is changing?
Well, it's interesting. Listening to Mike talk about the 1,000-seat theater and 70mm screenings, Los Angeles and New York City are pretty well served by some phenomenal film venues. But we're, an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of New York City and another 2 hours to Boston. So we're not really within driving distance to go to a movie of either of those cities. So we have a sort of captive audience of, hundreds of thousands of people in a kind of, 30-minute span. 30-minute drive who can come to our cinemas. And we're really finding, as I said, a huge uptick in student interest, and also just in general, I think it's sort of a virtuous cycle where the more you know about film, the more you're interested in seeing more of it, and the more that we can do to sort of educate viewers. You're not just coming to see this film, because almost all of these films can be seen on streaming platforms or rented somewhere. And so people want to see these films because it's an event, because it's a tangible item, and because it's something that you're doing that has sort of a contextualization around it. Maybe you have an introduction, maybe you have a guest speaker who has some expertise on it. And so we've found that we've had a really strong sort of uptick in audiences, and Yale also during the pandemic added to the one 35mm changeover space that we had on campus where we previously did our screenings, and built 2 more. So we now have 3 archivally sound screening rooms on campus that can do 35mm and 16, as well as DCP and other video formats. So we're kind of spoiled in that we have all these venues. Now, of course, there's a shortage of projectionists, so that's always the problem. There's always a breakdown somewhere in the line. But that's a problem that can be fixed, I think, more easily than building new venues. So we're looking at a kind of environment where there's just a huge upswing and a surge in interest in film, and it's the same. It's borne out in New York and Los Angeles with all of these venues, either newly built venues that are capable of screening film, or ones that have screened film for a long time, heavily emphasizing film in their programming and finding that audiences respond in a really strong way to those programs.
Wonderful, thank you. And I hope you've noticed, everyone, we're following the life cycle of film here, from stock through to filmmakers, through to the laboratory, preservation, restoration, viewing, and last but definitely not least, because we wouldn't be able to see these films without projectionists. So moving on to Alexa, or Lexi, as she likes to be called. Can you tell us about the changes over the last 2 decades and how that's impacted projectionists and projection skills?
Yeah, so for a long time, film was on film, and pretty much that was the only medium to project film on. And then as of 2005, the UK Digital Screen Network came about, which was a partnership between the UK Film Council, I believe the BFI were also involved, and a company called Arts Alliance. And this was an initiative to try and get digital projectors into cinemas, because at that point exhibitors were like, well, it works. Why do I need something new? Why do I need something different? So that initiative started putting digital projectors into, it's generally just one digital projector into, say, a multiplex of 10 screens, and it would be alongside the film equipment at that point. My first digital projector, I believe, was installed in my projection room in 2006. So that sort of took a few years. And there still was sort of a bit of reluctance there. It took a few more years before the technology was sort of beginning to be trusted. And then very, very rapidly, about 2009, it was almost like, almost like a river had just been let loose. And one after another, projection boxes were sort of being ripped out with the projectors. A lot of them were being sent to scrap, melted down. In the morning, a lot of it was done overnight. So projection team might be running film maybe on a Thursday right up to the last house, finishing at maybe 11 o'clock. And then overnight, the digital equipment would be installed, and the cinema would then open the next day and be projecting on digital. So it was very rapid, very fast. And I'd say between 2009 and 2011 is when it happened the most. Subsequently, because digital was able to have more automation with it, projections then started to be made redundant. We actually don't have the figures of how many that were made redundant, because no one was really counting at the time, but we estimate it's probably between 95 and 97% in the UK. And those projectionists that were able to keep their jobs were generally in specialist cinemas. So the way that I was able to sort of survive that changeover, I actually went to go work at an all-digital cinema, or it was going to become all-digital, and it was in Leicester Square, so we did the film premieres. So we were required to have technical staff there, and we actually still ran for quite a while 35mm as a backup, just before sort of digital fully took over. So yeah, it was quite a long process.
Absolutely. And you were describing there when the digital projectors were moved in. In some cases, the 35mm were pushed to the side, and where you had twin projectors, they lost one, basically, which is very sad, because with archival prints such as the beautiful 100 we've been making with lottery money, must mention that, we require them to be on two projectors. So that's so that they're not put up on a platter and not touched too much, so you have changeovers. And you need the skills for that, LEXI, to be able to do that. So in terms of projection skills, what skills are most at risk right now, and how can we, a big question, how can we combat that in the future?
Well, just generally being a projectionist, so the ability to actually inspect a print, repair it if necessary, and those skills, because film stock, each time it goes through a projector, starts to sort of degrade. It generally might need more repairs as the film print gets older and older. So you need to be able to sort of repair the print. And this is the other thing I didn't mention, actually. So a lot of companies that made the film projectors, they either went on to make different equipment or they went into liquidization. So all the film projectors that we're projecting on today are pretty much from the 1980s and earlier. I believe the ones in NFT1, which is the bigger screen here, are from the 1960s. So we're actually using this really old technology to sort of keep going. But the other thing was consumables, so like splicing tape, China graph pencil, all the things that we need, film gloves, things like that. Luckily, some of these things are used by other organisations, so the film gloves are often used by any kind of archivist, so we are still able to get hold of them. Splicing tape, I have been told, is used by police forces to lift fingerprints. So we were luckily able to still get hold of splicing tape. But lots of other consumables, it started becoming really, really difficult. And in relation to the skills, you need to be able to make a print up, you need to be able to repair a print, you need to be able to identify the soundtracks, the ratio. We always have whole history of the history of film can literally be seen on film prints going all the way back to the inception. And all those sound technologies, they just keep piling up over time. So we have to be able to project all of those ratios, all of those different sound technologies. So that often means quite a lot of equipment in the projection room to be able to switch between all of those elements. And then it's a different type of film projection styles. If you said the reel-to-reel with the two projectors in the one screen is an archive standard. So it means the projectionist needs to look for the Q dots and go from reel 1 on projector 1 to reel 2 on projector 2, and then reel 3, reel 4, and so on. So you have to have the patience and the ability to be able to see those Q dots, look at the screen at the right time, and allow the continuity to sort of happen.
And pay attention.
And pay attention.
In digital cinemas, sometimes one projectionist is running 5 screens.
It allowed.
They're not watching the film.
It basically allowed for because digital doesn't degrade, and it just allowed for that automation to be in place, and you didn't need the level of projectionist that you did previously to that.
So the big thing is around training then, LEXI, and I understand that you have travelled to Norway to train projectionists because there's nobody in Scandinavia to do that. Is this right?
There are people, but this is the difficulty. Peter and I have set up an organisation called the Film and Projection Heritage Network, and we're doing this generally outside of our full-time roles. And we're doing this to try and train projectionists just to keep those skills still there. And unfortunately for the cinema in Norway that we went to train the projectionists at, they couldn't get hold of anyone in the country to do it at a particular time. So they asked us to go fly out there and train them. And some of the people had some digital experience. Some of the people had no film experience at all. So we had to get people up to the same level. And this is on projection on changeovers, within a week. So it was a very, very intensive course for them, but they did really, really well. But yeah, this is coming in a lot. We've had to train projectionists across the UK. I've even had to give help out over social media to projectionists in America because different manufacturers have different projectors, and although the theory is generally the same, sometimes if you've not worked on a particular projector that you've come across, it's a bit different. And if there's no one around to ask or to help, it can get quite difficult. So I've actually had to assist on social media to help projectionist run a show in the US.
Amazing. So the Film and Projection Heritage Network, is it a charity? How does it work? And who are members?
So pretty much anyone can join. So please come and join. Please come and talk to us. Please come and find our website. We're very informal at the moment. You know, we're not an official organisation. It was just my colleague Peter, who's in the audience, and I, recognising that we could see projectionists weren't going to be able to get the training because a lot of that got lost. And we want to, you know, there's actually been a resurgence, as we said earlier, and, you know, film is coming back. And we're actually at this point now that we need projectionists, and we're finding that people, you know, are finding it very difficult to get trained. There's no official way of training. The way it was done previously was generally people would learn on the job. And if you're projecting 5 films a day, you know, 5 days of the week, you're going to pick that up and learn. And now, because celluloid screenings might be interspersed with digital screenings and might only be, say, a few a month, it's harder for people to get that level of knowledge and training.
Very important. Well, what I'm hoping is that forums like this are going to help the industry to come together, and that we'll be able to take what comes from a session like this forward and look at training and look at how, as an industry, we can all get together. There's a lot of industry folk in the audience here today as well. So that this hopefully will be a platform to shine a light on this.
You want to answer? All right.
There you go.
We are, and for the exact reason that you just mentioned earlier, and I think Davide said the same thing, that there is a magic in the photochemical process. Things that were perhaps forgotten are coming back. People are requesting all sorts of, you know, analog processing techniques. Silver retention, skip bleach is another name for it. We do a lot push-pull processing. We do a lot of cross-processing. It's the color reversal in our standard ECM processes. So yes is the answer. We're seeing more of it.
But sometimes there's as well some kind of paradox, because people shooting digitally asking to add thin grain.
Yeah.
And we have to scan a leader to extract the grain and to apply this.
I don't know what you're talking
I mean,
about.
I'm not joking.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Or some clients, we sort of do it from digital, go out to film, and then they scan that film again, and that adds some of the grain.
Absolutely.
So then, that's another way.
Yeah, DFT.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a great question. Without a specific answer to you, I mean, yes, we are. I think the easiest is just make contact with us. You know, I have my colleague is not here today, Sam Clarke, who looks after sales, but we have a lab here in London. We also work very closely with Cinelab. Just come and talk to us. It is in our interest to make it available. I think where we find that 16mm is a great gateway into shooting on film, and you know, it is the only format that we're seeing double-digit growth in. So it shows that it's working. Film is interesting. The technology that's out there scanning film at the moment is probably the best we've ever seen. So, you know, at one point, and I know, Paul, you will remember this, the dark days of the BBC saying 16mm was dead. You know, that was it. No more 16mm. 16mm wasn't high def. We're seeing some of the best films ever produced originate on 16mm. 34 titles went through to the Cannes Film Festival this year. I don't know the number, but I would say a great percentage of them were originated on 16. So just come and talk to us.
Yeah, it's definitely an increasing worry. I mean, as a projectionist, I've actually had to learn engineering skills just to be able to keep sort of projectors running. All of my colleagues, I believe there's 22 projectionists at the BFI on the books, but all of us have eBay tabs because we're looking for that equipment constantly to potentially be able to quickly buy it and have it as a backup or install it into the film projectors as needed. But the other thing that's coming up now is there aren't necessarily parts available when they break. So it's how do we fabricate parts? So then we're having to go out to people that can potentially 3D print or even make things out of metal, and to be able to sort of replicate the part to be able to put it in the projector to keep going. And actually, with the Film Projection and Heritage Network, one of our big things was to try and network cinemas together, because a lot of them were projecting film in isolation. So it's about trying to get that knowledge sharing happening, that skill sharing happening, and potentially that part sharing happening. Because I've actually helped out two quite prominent cinemas in London with parts when they didn't have any, and I'd happen to have some that I'd squirreled away as things were going in skips, and I could sort of produce it 9 years later and be like, look, here's the part you need, there you go. So yeah, a lot of it's about the knowledge and the parts, and it's just trying to get those people together to knowledge share, to pass on those skills. And at the moment, I'd say it is quite a unstable area, but hopefully we can keep sharing that knowledge and get it passed down.
You know, doing it at an artisan level, it's possible. Doing it on a much bigger level, on a much more, let's call it, image stable level, because again, you know, we're talking about machines that run at 100 feet a minute, have 450 liters of solution in them for a reason. You know, you have to stabilize it. You can't do it at an artisan level. It works. It's great. Yeah. There are a lot of programs underway, some of which I can talk about, some of which we're still in the early stages of development, to look at the nasties and take them out of the equation. So a lot of people say to me, hey, Kodak, when are you bringing back Kodachrome? You know, those that remember Kodachrome will say, what a fantastic product. It was a fantastic product. We couldn't bring that back if we tried. There is just some nasty chemicals in that are banned on a worldwide basis. Our development team constantly look at that. But what has happened over the last few years, you'll find that the labs have all taken it upon themselves to look at their chemistry, look at the way they discharge chemistry, and recycle. We spend a lot of time recycling. I think that partly answers your question. I don't think there is any industry that's going to turn around and say, we're completely environmentally friendly, we're completely green. You just can't get there. But what you can do is take, you know, decisive steps and actions to move us toward that goal. The other thing that's really important, and Lexi, you just brought about, you're running a projector that's from the 1960s down there. Show me a video camera that's from the, well, we didn't have video cameras, but show me a video camera from the early 90s, early noughties that's still in circulation. They're not, they're in skips, they've been scrapped, they've been trashed. We tend to recycle digital equipment far faster than we have on any of these processors. I know of labs that are running with processors that are 40, 50 years old. And the camera, completely correct, Paul. So.
But for instance, in the new project we have in Bologna, because we are building up a new facilities, we are going to reuse, filtered of course, the water for the processing that will go to some tank underground to cooling the building.
Yes, yes, heat exchangers.
I mean, I can say, you know, obviously some of the recent prints that we've made in concert with the BFI, like a couple of prints of the Godfather films, were big draws, but you sort of knew that was going to happen. One other kind of odd thing we did is we took a very young Yale filmmaker, an alumnus who was in his late 20s, early 30s, and he made a film that was meant to be released in cinemas, and the pandemic hit. And so this film called Palm Springs was kind of one of the first sort of pandemic movies. Everyone was watching it on Hulu at home. It was also a kind of a Groundhog Day style movie where the same day was repeating, so it felt much like the pandemic. But anyway, I reached out to him and I said, how would you like to make a 35 millimeter print of your film? And he was right on board from the beginning and put us in touch with his distributor. We had a lab in the United States do a direct positive from a digital file, which is, I would argue, questionable in terms of preservation, but in terms of exhibition, it's wonderful. And we brought him out to New Haven and we showed the film, and he'd never seen the film with an audience outside of the Sundance Film Festival because it never had any theatrical screenings except for a couple of drive-ins. And so it was a really moving moment for him. No one else had ever seen it on the big screen like that before. And he also said that the film print sort of softened the digital effects, which they didn't have enough money to do really, really well. So it actually kind of made the whole thing look really wonderful. So that's an example of the way a special film print, and that's the only film print of that film in the world. And it's a way that you can really bring a kind of special, one-of-a-kind moment to audiences.
Yeah, we've actually looked into it unofficially sort of here as a projection team because we needed to replace one of the film gates on our projectors. We did a few tests, but unfortunately at the moment we couldn't get the tensile strength needed, at least with the printing process we were looking at. But I do believe it will be a future, something that is really going to help us in the future. So it's potentially not quite there yet, or at least it hasn't been for us. There might well be projectionists who are doing it successfully in other parts of the world, but yeah, I think it will be something that will help a huge amount.
Okay, I think we're going to finish on time in that case, unless there's anybody with a burning question. But to be continued, I think this is a really important discussion. It's really important to get the industry together and focus on this. And we will be in touch with some of you to be able to help move this forward and look at training, look at skills, look at the future to keep film on film.